Everyone in our town knew my husband, Travis, as the man who built his company from nothing. The self-made success story. The founder. The local legend. The guy who'd started with an idea and built an empire with his own 2 hands. Or so the story always went. He told that story at every dinner party, every barbecue, every chance he got, how he'd risked everything and willed a thriving business into existence out of sheer grit. And I would sit beside him and smile and let him tell it, because I loved him, and because there was just one small detail he always conveniently left out. The company wasn't his. It was mine. I had funded every single dollar of that nothing he supposedly started with. The capital, the seed money, the safety net under all of it, that was me. And when we set the business up, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, the company was legally, completely, and on every formation document that mattered, put in my name. For 9 years, that detail didn't matter, because we were a team. And what was mine was ours, and I was happy to let him be the face while I was the foundation. And then I found out about Monica, and suddenly that one small detail he'd spent 9 years leaving out of the story, whose name was really on the company, became the only detail that mattered in the entire world. This is the story of a man who cheated on the woman who funded his entire empire, and then made the single greatest miscalculation of his life by forgetting to ask one simple question. Guess whose name the company was actually under all along? But before I tell you, I want to ask you something. And I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Have you ever quietly made someone else's success possible, funded it, supported it, built the foundation under it, and then watched them take all the credit as if they'd done it alone? How did that feel? And what did you do? Be honest. Because for 9 years I was content to be the invisible foundation, right up until the man standing on it decided to step off it and into someone else's bed. Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And before I go on, I want to say one thing to everyone watching who is right now the quiet foundation under somebody else's spotlight, the one who funds, supports, organizes, enables, and watches someone else collect the applause. There is nothing wrong with being that person. The world runs on quiet foundations, and choosing to lift someone you love is a genuinely beautiful thing. But I want you to do one small thing for yourself today that I almost forgot to do for years. Simply know your own contribution. Keep it real and clear in your own mind, even when no one else acknowledges it. Even when the story everyone tells leaves you out. You don't have to demand credit. You just have to never ever lose track of the truth of what you've built, because that private knowledge is the ground you'll stand on if the day ever comes when you need it. Be the foundation if you choose to. Just always remember that you are one. Let me explain how the company came to be in my name, because that single fact is the hinge the entire story turns on, and it was not some clever scheme. It was simply the truth of how things happened. When Travis and I married, I was the one with the resources. I'd been careful, I'd saved, I had family money and good credit and a real head for risk. Travis had charisma, big dreams, and very little else. So when he came to me with an idea for a business, it was my capital that funded it, my credit that backed it, my savings on the line if it failed. And so, when we formed the company on the advice of an accountant, for reasons of credit and liability and simple practicality, the business was established in my name. I was the owner of record, the founding member, the person every legal and financial document pointed to. Travis ran the day-to-day. Travis was the face. But on paper, from the very first day, the company belonged to me. I want to be clear that I did not put my name on that company as some defensive maneuver, some quiet insurance policy against a betrayal I saw coming. I want to say that plainly, because the cleverness of how this ended can make it sound calculated from the start. And it wasn't. I put my name on it because it was the honest truth of the situation. It was my money and my risk. And the accountant said this was the sensible way to structure it. And I signed where I was told to sign and never thought about it again. That's almost the saddest part, looking back. I wasn't protecting myself. I was just being practical and trusting and building a life with a man I assumed would always be my partner in it. The fact that this ordinary, trusting decision turned out to be the thing that saved me was pure accident. It's a lucky accident I'm grateful for every day. But I'd be lying if I called it foresight. It was just the truth, sitting quietly in a drawer, waiting for the day it would matter. And here is the thing about being the quiet foundation. Over time, even you start to forget your load-bearing. Travis told the self-made story so many times that I think he came to believe it. And somewhere along the way, so did everyone else. And so, almost, did I. His company. His success. He'd say it, and I'd smile. And the truth of whose name was on the incorporation papers just sat there quietly in a drawer, gathering dust. Irrelevant, because we were a team. You don't check whose name is on the deed when you're happily living in the house together. You only remember it matters the day someone tries to throw you out. That sentence is, I think, the whole hidden lesson of long marriages and shared lives, and I didn't understand it until I lived it. When things are good, the legal architecture of your life becomes invisible. Who owns what? Whose name is on which document? Who would be entitled to what? If it all came apart, none of it feels real. Because you're a team, and teams don't keep score. And that invisibility is beautiful when the love is real. But it is also a kind of vulnerability, because the day the love stops being real, that architecture comes roaring back into relevance all at once, and whoever happens to know it best and hold it most clearly has an enormous advantage. Travis let the architecture go invisible because he assumed he'd never need it. I had let it go invisible too, but my name was the one written into the foundation. So when the walls came down, I was the one still standing on solid ground. Now here is where I have to be honest about the misdirection, because it is the whole engine of how this ended. And it began with Travis misdirecting himself. Travis genuinely believed the company was his. Not legally, he must have known, somewhere, whose name was on the paperwork, but emotionally, completely, in the way that actually drives a person's behavior. He'd been the boss for so long, told the story so many times, been treated as the founder by so many people, that the legal reality had become, in his mind, a technicality. A footnote. Something that surely wouldn't matter if it ever came to it. And that comfortable forgetting that was the unlocked door I would eventually walk through. He had stopped seeing me as the owner of anything. He saw me as the wife of the owner, who happened to be himself. There's a particular arrogance in this kind of forgetting, and it's worth naming, because it's the exact flaw that brings men like Travis down. He didn't forget whose name was on the company because he was stupid. He forgot because he'd spent 9 years being told he was brilliant, by clients, by friends, by a town that loved his self-made story, and most of all, by himself. Praise, repeated long enough, becomes a kind of amnesia. He had heard you built this so many times that the inconvenient truth that someone else had funded and legally owned it simply got crowded out of his mind by the version that felt better. That's how the powerful and the praised so often undo themselves. Not through a single dramatic error, but through the slow, comfortable forgetting of the people and the facts that actually hold them up. Travis didn't lose the company because he made a mistake at the end. He lost it because he'd spent 9 years believing his own press. And then came Monica. I found out the way you often do, slowly, then all at once. The late nights at the office, the new attention to his appearance, the phone that never left his hand. Monica was younger, and she worked in his orbit. And Travis had clearly decided that his great self-made success had earned him a great self-made reward. I'll spare you the worst of the discovery, because you've felt it before even if you haven't lived it. What matters is that by the time I understood the full picture, I understood something else along with it. Travis was not just having an affair. He was preparing, in his confident way, to leave, to trade up, to take his empire and his new woman and start the next glorious chapter, leaving me, the supportive little wife, behind with whatever scraps he decided I deserved. What stung most, in those early days of understanding, was not even the affair itself. It was the casual confidence of his plan, the way he so clearly assumed I would simply accept whatever he handed me. He had spent so long thinking of me as the lesser partner, the supportive backdrop to his brilliance, that the idea of me fighting back, let alone winning, didn't seem to occur to him. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't careful. He moved through those weeks like a man who'd already won, because in his mind the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The successful founder keeps his company and his freedom. The grateful wife takes her modest settlement and disappears. The sheer breezy certainty of it told me everything about how invisible I'd become to him. And strangely, it steadied me. Because a man that's certain is a man who isn't checking his assumptions, and his entire plan rested on an assumption that was, at its foundation, completely false. If your stomach just turned imagining a man planning to leave you behind with scraps while standing on a fortune you funded, do me one quick favor before I tell you what I did. Tap like and subscribe to the channel. I'm not asking for nothing. These calm, strategic revenge stories get buried by the algorithm unless people actually engage. And your one tap is the only reason the next one reaches a woman who is, tonight, watching someone take credit for everything she built. And believe me, the question Travis forgot to ask is the part you came for. Because here is what Travis had planned, as best I could tell. He would file for divorce, framing himself as the successful founder generously parting ways with his less impressive wife. He would keep his company the source of all our wealth, the engine of the lifestyle Monica was so excited about, and he would walk away with the empire, leaving me to argue, as the supportive spouse, for some modest slice of his success. It was a good plan. It had only one flaw, and the flaw was enormous. The empire was not his to keep. It never had been. So I did exactly what I have learned is the most powerful thing a quietly underestimated person can do. I did nothing to tip him off. Every instinct I had screamed to confront him, to throw the truth in his face, to make him understand in that moment exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. But I had learned somewhere in those hard weeks that the urge to be understood is the enemy of the goal of winning. Travis didn't need to understand anything yet. He needed to keep believing he held all the cards, so he'd keep playing the careless, confident game of a man who thinks he's already won. The version of me that needed him to see the truth could wait. The version of me that needed to protect my future could not. So I chose protection over the satisfaction of being seen, and I kept my face calm, and my voice warm, and my mouth shut. I let him keep believing the company was his. I let him plan his confident exit, because the moment he understood the truth, he would lawyer up and start fighting to change a reality he couldn't actually change, and I would much rather he walked in believing he held the empire, and discovered the truth at the exact moment it could do the most good and the least damage. So I smiled, and I played the supportive wife, and I went quietly to see a lawyer of my own. She looked at the formation documents, the ownership records, the funding history showing whose capital had built every bit of it. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she actually smiled, and she said 3 things I will never forget. The first, Dana, I want to make sure you understand what you're holding here. Because I don't think you fully do. This is not a case where we argue about your fair share of his business. This is your business. You are the owner of record. He has been running a company that legally belongs to you. The conversation we're going to have with his lawyer is not about how much of his empire you get. It's about the fact that there is no his empire. There never was. The second, she explained that because the company was formed in my name, funded with my documented capital, and held in my ownership from day one, Travis's emotional belief that it was his had no legal weight whatsoever. He was, in the eyes of the documents, something much closer to a very senior employee of a company I owned than a co-founder of his own. His grand exit plan, keep the company, leave the wife, was built on owning something he didn't own. And the third thing she said, quietly, she said, let him file. Let him make his confident first move thinking he holds the cards. Then we simply remind everyone, with the paperwork, whose name is actually on the company. The most powerful position in the world is to be the true owner of the thing your opponent believes is his. So that is exactly what I did. I waited. And it was a strange few weeks, watching Travis stride around so sure of himself, making his quiet preparations, perhaps even telling Monica about the wonderful future they'd have running his successful company together. He had no idea he was a guest in a house I owned, redecorating it for another woman, about to be reminded whose name was on the deed. I almost felt sorry for him, watching it. Almost there was a moment, near the end, when he almost gave himself away and almost gave me away. He came home one evening, expansive and warm in the way guilty people sometimes are, and he started talking, vaguely, about the future of the business, about some changes he was thinking about how he'd always taken care of everything. And I realized he was testing the water, seeing if I'd push back, gauging how hard the supportive little wife would be to step over. And I just smiled and said it all sounded great, and that I trusted him completely. Because I needed him confident. I needed him to walk all the way out onto the branch. And a man who thinks his wife will roll over does not check whose name is on the company before he files. I have thought a lot about how close I came to ruining it in those weeks, because the temptation to speak was almost physical. When your husband sits across from you, warm and expansive, casually planning a future that erases you, every cell in your body wants to stand up and say, "It's mine. All of it, you fool. It was always mine." The satisfaction of that sentence, delivered in the moment, would have been enormous. And it would have cost me everything, because the instant Travis knew, he would have stopped being a confident man making careless assumptions and started being a frightened man fighting hard, moving fast, hiring aggressively, trying every possible angle to manufacture a claim to a company he didn't own. By staying silent, I kept him careless. I let him keep building his case on sand, never once suspecting that the tide was already mine to command. The silence was agony. The silence was also the entire victory. I just had to want winning more than I wanted the momentary pleasure of being right out loud. Then, finally, Travis made his move. He sat me down, with the rehearsed calm of a man who believes he holds every card, and he told me he wanted a divorce. He was almost kind about it, in the condescending way of someone being generous with what he assumes is his. He said he knew it would be hard for me, that he'd make sure I was taken care of, that the company and the bulk of the assets were of course tied up in the business he'd built, but that he wasn't a monster and we'd work something out. He was, in his mind, letting me down easy, handing me my scraps. I let him finish. I let him lay out his entire confident vision of the future. And then I slid a folder across the table. Inside were the formation documents, the ownership records, the funding history, every page pointing to the same name, the only name that had ever legally mattered, on every document that established who actually owned the company. Mine. I watched Travis's rehearsed calm curdle into confusion, and then into something close to panic. As he understood what he was looking at, the company he'd just generously offered to work something out about was not his to offer. The empire he was planning to keep and share with Monica and build his glorious next chapter on had belonged to me from the very first day. He had spent 9 years telling a self-made story so convincingly that he'd forgotten the one fact that undid all of it. And now it was sitting in a folder on the table between us. What I remember most vividly about that moment is how the power in the room physically shifted, like weather changing. Travis had walked into that conversation as the protagonist, the successful man magnanimously concluding a chapter, in full control of the narrative and the assets. And in the space of about 30 seconds, page by page, he became something else. A man discovering in real time that he had never been the owner of the story he'd been starring in. I watched him reach for his usual confidence and find it gone. Because confidence built on a false premise doesn't survive contact with the true one. He had no script for this. He'd rehearsed the speech where he was generous and in charge. He had not rehearsed the one where the woman he'd dismissed turned out to hold the entire foundation in her name. There was simply nothing for him to say, because the documents had already said all of it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I said the only sentence I had prepared. I said, Travis, you spent 9 years telling everyone you built this company. I let you, because I loved you. But you never once asked whose name it was actually under. It's mine. It always has been. He tried after that to do all the things they do. He said I was twisting things, that the company was ours no matter whose name was on it. That I couldn't really mean to take away everything he'd worked for. And I noticed something in those protests that I want to share, because it's so revealing. In the very same breath that he insisted the company was really his, he was now suddenly calling it ours. A minute earlier, when he thought he held it, it had been entirely his empire, his success, his to keep. Now that he understood I held it, it had urgently become a shared marital project we'd built together. The ownership shifted in his rhetoric the instant his advantage shifted in reality. That's the tell of a man who was never operating on principle, only on leverage. When he had the leverage, fairness meant he kept everything. The moment I had it, fairness suddenly meant we shared. I declined to be moved by a sense of fairness that only switched on the second it benefited him. The divorce was not the divorce Travis had planned. It could not be, because the central asset he'd built his whole strategy around was never his to take. The company remained mine, because it had always been mine. He did not walk away with the empire. He walked away as a man who had to start actually building something from nothing, for the first time in his life, at an age when that is a great deal harder. The documented affair did him no favors in the rest of the settlement, either. And I kept the company I had funded and owned all along, and I ran it, by the way, perfectly well without him, which I suspect was its own special insult. That part deserves its own moment, because it was the sweetest and quietest victory of all. For 9 years, the unspoken assumption Travis's, the town's, and if I'm honest, sometimes even mine, had been that the company succeeded because of Travis. That his charisma and vision were the engine and my role was merely to have written the first check. And then he was gone, and the company didn't falter. It thrived. I stepped out from behind the foundation and into the running of it, and it turned out that the woman who had funded it, structured it, and quietly understood its finances for 9 years was entirely capable of leading it too. Every good quarter after he left was a silent rebuttal to 9 years of self-made mythology. The company never needed Travis to survive. It had only ever needed the person whose name was on it. It turned out that was the whole secret, and it had been true the entire time. Monica, I heard, was considerably less interested in Travis once the successful founder she'd signed up for turned out to be a man who'd just been spectacularly removed from a company he never owned. There is not much romance in a self-made man who, it turns out, was made entirely by his wife. I'll admit there was a quiet, complicated grief mixed in with the vindication, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. Because here's the truth that doesn't fit neatly on a thumbnail. I had wanted Travis to be the man he pretended to be. For 9 years, I hadn't minded being the invisible foundation, hadn't resented funding his dream or letting him have the spotlight, because I believed we were building something together, and that my quiet contribution was seen and valued even if it wasn't announced. The pain wasn't losing the marriage. The pain was learning that the partnership I thought I'd been in had, somewhere along the way, become a performance I was financing for an audience that no longer included me. The company was always mine. What I'd actually lost, what no folder could give back, was the belief that the man I'd built it for had ever truly seen me standing underneath it all. That grief was real. But it didn't change a single thing about what I was entitled to, and I made very sure not to let it. And if you'll let me leave you with one thing, not just as someone who got revenge, but as a woman who spent 9 years happily being the invisible foundation under someone else's name, it's this. Be generous. Be supportive. Build the people you love all the way up. But never, ever forget what is actually yours. Know whose name is on the company, the deed, the account, the documents that decide who owns what. Not out of suspicion, not because you're planning for betrayal, but because the day you most need to know is the day it will already be too late to find out. People who genuinely love you will never need you to forget your own contribution. The ones who quietly hope you've forgotten are the ones already planning to step off your foundation and onto someone else's. Remember whose name is on the paperwork. It might be the most important thing you ever remember. And remember the deeper version of that lesson too. The most valuable thing you own is not the company, or the house, or the account. It is the clear, unshakable knowledge of what you have actually contributed to your own life. No one can take that from you, no matter what story they tell, as long as you refuse to forget it yourself. Travis could rewrite the company's history at every dinner party. He could never quite rewrite the documents, and he could never rewrite what I knew. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. There's one more thing, though. A few months after the divorce, as I was finally going through the company's older records as its sole and undisputed owner, I found something Travis had buried in the files years ago, a document that revealed the affair with Monica was not the first time, and that the self-made story he'd told for 9 years hid something about the very beginning of the business that even I had never known. What I found, and what I did once I understood it, is a story entirely its own. And it might just be the most satisfying one yet. It's right there on your screen. You are going to want to see how that one ends.